These 3 minutes of life were taken out of the flow of time by David Kurtz in 1938. His grandson, Glenn Kurtz, discovered them in 2009 in a closet in Palm Beach Garden, Florida.
My grandfather was born in Poland in 1888.
So my grandfather was only 4 years old when he came to the United States. He grew up feeling himself to be American. By the mid-1930s, he and my grandmother had a family, and they were living in Brooklyn. And they began to travel a little bit. The trip that they took to Europe, I call it the Grand Tour. I think that, like prosperous Americans, the thing to do when you achieved a certain socioeconomic level was you went to Europe. And so on this trip, my grandparents were in Paris, they were in Amsterdam, they were in Zurich and Geneva, they went to the south of France, they were in London. And the trip to Poland was an extraordinary detour.
In Warsaw, David Kurtz rented a car. Where did he go? What do we see? Is it possible to locate a place solely from looking? If you don't see the Eiffel Tower, how do you know you're in Paris? They say, one picture is worth 1,000 words. But for that phrase to make sense, you do need to know what it is you're looking at. David Kurtz rented a black sedan. Where did he get out?
When I discovered the film, I didn't know at all where it was taken, and I asked my father and my aunt, and they both said that they thought it was my grandmother's hometown, called Berezna. It was on the Polish-Ukrainian border. It was a town of about 3,000 Jews, and in August of 1942, the entire Jewish population was murdered. It took me about 6 months to find a survivor, and eventually I did find a man who lived in Florida, and within a second of looking at this film, he said, "It's not my town."
Like any recording device, film by itself preserves detail without necessarily conveying knowledge. Solely from these images, we cannot determine the place, but we can establish the time of day. This must have happened before this.
The shadow on the balconies cuts at perhaps a 50-degree angle. It's around 11 in the morning.
The Meteorological Institute in Warsaw recorded at 11 a.m. on that day, temperature 24.1 degrees Celsius, light northeast wind with slight cloud cover.
I assumed if it wasn't my grandmother's hometown, it was almost certainly my grandfather's hometown. I was able to find a photograph of one of the buildings, in fact, of the synagogue in the town, and it showed the doors of this synagogue. And actually, there's a carved panel on the upper left panel of one of the doors. There's a lion, the Lion of Judah. And it's very distinctive. And in this photograph, which was clearly marked as being of the Nasielsk synagogue, there's that lion. So it was from this that I was able to confirm that the town in the film is Nasielsk.
It is Thursday, the 4th of August, 1938. A black sedan drives 5 Americans to the small town of Nasielsk, 30 miles north of Warsaw. The town had 7,000 inhabitants in 1938, of whom 3,000 were Jewish. Fewer than 100 of them survived the Holocaust.
Nasielsk was not an important town unless you lived there. It was just a town. But of all the Polish towns destroyed in the Holocaust, Nasielsk is among the very few that exist in moving pictures, among just a handful preserved in color.
Nothing I learned about the people in my grandfather's film could prevent their deaths or bring them back to life. No film, no memorial, and no recollection could restore, retrieve, recover, or revive this world. All I could do, all anyone could do, was to piece together the few fragments of their lives that remained, to show their edges and absences, defining the loss of that world by detailing the little of it that had been preserved. In this way, we might succeed in keeping the memory of the dead alive, of remembering them despite the fact that they are dead.
The film by David Kurtz was found and restored just before it would have been lost forever due to damage and decay. The material had shrunk, curled in on itself, and eventually fused into a single mass. If it had been found a month later, it would have been impossible to restore it all. Just in time, the Holocaust Museum in Washington sent it to a colour lab, where they set about saving what they could. Among other issues, the celluloid suffered from vinegar syndrome, from shrinking, crazing, edge weave, cupping, and buckling.
Sklep spożywczy.
My first purpose in researching the film was to try to identify the people. But without enough information, it's impossible to identify the people. If you don't know who they are, or if you don't have someone who can tell you who they are, there's almost no way to find out their name. So I had to look in the frame at all of the other information that was visible. And all of that information, I thought, might possibly lead to an identification. And one of the signs that immediately caught my attention is over the doorway of what appears to be some kind of a shop. And there's a woman who steps out of that doorway and looks down the street. And I thought, if I could learn what that sign says, perhaps I could identify this woman.
Sklep spożywczy.
When I looked at the second line and played with the letters and spoke with the Polish speaker, I was able to come up with at least the first number of letters which hinted at what it probably meant. And the word means grocery.
Spożywczy.
Well, the third line almost certainly gives the name of the person whose grocery store it was. But the third line is the hardest to read. And I captured that frame. I altered the saturation and the contrast. I did everything I could do. Ultimately, I sent the film back to the laboratory, and they looked at the original frames under a microscope. And their conclusion was that the letters cannot be made out.
In all languages, after black and white, red was the first colour to be named. In some languages, the word for red is still the same as the word for blood. Here we see a red flower, a red dress, a red bow, a red headscarf, a red belt, a red sweater, a red hat, a red cheek, a red lip. All colours fade, but the colour red fades the slowest. The colours we see here are the result of a complicated chemical process involving silver, plastic and cellulose. The film emulsion is made of gelatin, the same gelatin you eat, made of the bones and skin of cattle, a very 19th century recipe. Around the square Nasielsk, we see trees, a very generic word, trees. Christmas trees, palm trees, beeches, birches, bonsai, all trees. Here we clearly see a deciduous tree, found on many streets but never given a second thought. Like birds can stay simply birds for years. Maybe they never even become blackbirds or raven or jackdaws. The director of the botanical garden in Poznan states that the trees are linden trees, little leaf linden trees even, or Tilia cordata, according to the determination system invented by botanist Carl Linnaeus, whose name in his native Swedish, Linn, also means linden tree. They're quite common in the Western Hemisphere. These are the trees that gave the Unter den Linden Boulevard in Berlin its name. David Kurtz sent a postcard from this very boulevard to his children in Brooklyn 2 days after visiting Nasielsk on the 6th of August, 1938. He wrote to them from a cafe called Linden, located on Unter den Linden number 44. Here we are in Berlin, enjoying a nice glass of beer. There are also things in the film that have not been named yet. What is this thing hanging from the wall, for example? Some sort of tank? A samovar? And this thing slung over a blind, a bicycle tire, a part of a horse harness? Maybe this one was referred to as a rzecz, which is Polish for thing. Or someone asked, "Get me that zak," in Yiddish. What you see is what you know. Who has spotted the little rectangular shapes on the doorposts? A mezuzah is a small ritual object traditionally affixed to the doorway of a Jewish home. The case contains a piece of parchment with a prayer written on it in Hebrew. This fulfills the biblical commandment to write the words of God on the gates and doorposts of your house. The Lion of Judah frequently appeared on the doors of synagogues before they were destroyed or turned into warehouses, garages, observatories, cinemas or stables, like this one. The synagogue of Nasielsk, located just northeast of the market square, was demolished only after the war. Fragments of the building are still found today. There were originally 2 lions, one on each door. The Polish historian Zdzisław Sawinski, head of the school in Nasielsk, knows what happened to the one on the right, already before the war, when Polish nationalists frequently harassed Jewish citizens.
W roku 1938, w czasie jednego z tumultów w Nasielsku, tumultów, w którym brała udział m.in. młodzież polska, zniszczone zostały drzwi synagogi. Zniszczenie polegało na tym, że oderwany został jeden z lwów i od tej pory drzwi miały tylko jednego lwa. Na wieść o tych zajściach zabierał głos nawet minister spraw wewnętrznych w Warszawie.
When I found the film, I donated it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They were able to restore the film and digitize it, and they put it on their website. During this time, I had begun searching for survivors, and I had been unsuccessful in locating anyone who could tell me anything about the people that we're seeing. 2 years after I donated the film, I got an email out of the blue from a woman in Detroit, and she told me in this email that someone had brought the film to her attention and she'd viewed it online. And as the camera panned across the crowd and all the children are jumping and waving, she suddenly saw a face and recognized her grandfather as a 13-year-old boy.
I saw my grandfather's face, and I heard my dad on the phone say to my mom, "There's your father." I said, "It's Grandpa." It's him.
My father's face is so recognizable because of the full cheeks that I think a lot of us in the family inherited from my dad. When my daughter called my father, the first thing he said was, "Now you know I'm not from Mars."
I recognized myself immediately, but I couldn't remember what was the occasion. This was my cap that I wore. This was what we wore, the Yeshiva boys. I remember I took my cap off just to be defiant. And when I came home, I had to put it on. I remember my grandfather, and one time I think he saw me without a hat, and he went berserk. Oh my God, he talked to my mother, "Look, he's going without a hat." I mean, that's such a craziness, when I look back, but this is what their life. They lived the religion to such a degree. They had such standards.
When we first watched the film together, Mr. Chandler was most excited to describe the differences between the hats. The top of the socioeconomic spectrum, there were these black caps with a small brim that signified that the boy was in cheder, the religious school. Next to him in the film, there's a boy wearing a cloth, what we would call a newsboy cap.
By the way, by his hat wearing, he was not in my circle. And this kid was somebody that my parents were not allowed to associate with.
And the fact that he's standing next to him in the film is a sign of how mixed up the community became as a result of my grandfather's presence and the fact of the movie camera having scrambled the social hierarchy.
Nobody had cameras like that. It was like a novelty. It was like a magic moment. Look, he holds like this, and it goes and makes pictures. Nobody ever was familiar with it. It was a great novelty. I mean, goes around with this, and how does he take pictures?
My grandfather was an amateur filmmaker, a very amateur filmmaker. I learned from my aunt that he had only purchased the camera in June of 1938, the month before they set off on this trip. The camera was a magazine Cine Kodak that could be loaded alternately with black and white or with a Kodachrome full-color magazine. My grandfather had probably never used it before he went on this trip. In fact, I'm almost certain that these are the first films that he took with it. So he didn't know anything about the camera itself. And in fact, in the black and white scenes, I'm almost certain he's trying to shoot above the heads of the children in order to show the buildings. He wants to show this is where we are. But the children get in the way, and so he kind of gives up and allows them into the frame.
Perhaps you've noticed, his walking stick keeps waving. I tried to imagine what must have happened, because he had his cane in one hand. He always had a walking stick with him. But the camera needs two hands to operate. And so it keeps going back and forth in front of the lens as he's trying to move the camera around.
All the kids around were Jewish. This kid I know, his name was Talmud. I think I identify him.
Chaim Talmud.
Yeah.
What do you remember about him?
It's a kid I went to Cheder with, nothing special. Yeah, him I remember very well. Oh, there's the woman from the shul again.
This one. And would she be the mother of the girl with the brown braids?
The girl appears frequently in the film, moving with my grandfather's lens to remain on camera, and popping up in almost every scene of the color section. But her face was not familiar to Maury. I wondered, because of his strict religious upbringing, whether Maury would recognize any of the girls in the film. No, that would be beyond my scope, he'd said, looking at girls. Another thing not allowed.
The dresses of the women and girls are the most colourful things on show. According to costume historians, the fabrics were quite common at the time. You could have bought the same patterns in Prague or Amsterdam.
Deutsche Mode aus Zichenau. Zichenau, 30. Oktober. Von polnischer Wirtschaft zu deutscher Wertarbeit. Dazwischen scheint ein Abstand zu liegen, der nicht ohne weiteres zu überbrücken ist. Aber der deutsche Aufbau hat neben vielen anderen auch dieses Wunder bewerkstelligt.
In October 1941, 3 years after these images were filmed, Nasielsk is mentioned in an article in the German press.
But even when one is aware of the miracle of the German rebuilding of the East, one is still amazed that in the region Zichenau, of all places, products of the highest quality are made. But the valuable buttons that serve as jewelry on expensive dresses indeed come for a considerable part from the small East Prussian town Nasielsk. The Nasielsk button factory already existed in Polish times, but then it was a workshop filled with dust that mocked even the most primitive standards of hygiene. And what was made there was the cheapest trash. Now the buttons that are produced here go to the big firms in the empire, and when the eyes of women admiringly look up at the new creations, nobody will guess that the buttons, so masterfully crafted, come from a factory in the East, that 2 years ago was still such a real Polish pigsty that nobody would have predicted a future for it.
Więc tutaj na terenie Nasielska działała taka prężnie fabryka właściciela żydowskiego Filara, której celem była produkcja guzików, małych guziczków, więc na pewno guziki powinny się znaleźć na filmie, to gwarantuję.
I remember I used to walk by and we heard the presses all day. We were afraid. We looked in through the windows. We saw machines that they made special buttons. I think it was from Mother of Pearl and more, and Bakelite.
The Germans took over the button factory from the Jewish owners in September 1939. It did not reopen after the war.
We used to play, what did we play with little rocks, or something like, and every year they had something that they collected. So they come in different sizes, little ones, big ones. So we used to collect and we would trade the little ones, the big ones, all of them. And then came a year where we were collecting buttons. So buttons, they were galore. All the women have buttons and every man buttons. And then one day we were in the Stiebel on a winter day. Everybody wore heavy coats with a dozen buttons this big. So I said to Leslie, I said, Leslie, there's a gold mine here of buttons. Look, they're all hanging on the wall. And he says, so what do you mean? I says, we'll cut them off. I says, we'll be the richest. The kids are going to envy us with all these buttons. So I said, okay. So while they're all praying, we're standing against the wall with a razor blade and we're cutting buttons. At the end of the service, everybody is wishing good Shabbos, this and that, and they start putting on the coats, and they're going up and down, up and down, on the winter. Oh my God, I remember my grandfather knew right away. There he is, and we have the big Shabbat meal, and he can't sit at this table. Look what he did. Look at this, like I killed somebody and so on. I mean, these are memories that I have. What was in my mind at that time? There was, the stuff that came later didn't exist then. I had no fear about it. I felt very comfortable in this society, in the group. Everything was routine. We had my parents, my brothers, and my uncles. Everybody was there. It was a very comfortable existence. I said to myself, if somebody told me what a couple of years later, what I was going to have to do, I wouldn't believe it, probably. And that smile, I don't know what was I must have been happy or something.
Dnia 3 grudnia 1939 roku o godzinie 7:30 rano rozległ się po miasteczku donośny głos dzwonu.
In the Ringelblum archives in Warsaw, a document has been preserved that describes what happened on this square in December 1939.
On December 3rd, 1939, at 7:30 in the morning, the sound of a bell rang out through the village. The town official announced that all Jewish men, Jewish women, and children must gather in the town square within 15 minutes. No one knew what was happening. It could be sensed that something menacing hung in the air. At the same time, word spread that the Volksdeutsche were barging into Jewish homes, looting them, and evicting their inhabitants. A terrible chaos arose. Frightened Jews began gathering in the square. Some brought with them small satchels, carrying them on hunched backs, and others brought their own carts on which they had placed a portion of their belongings. In addition to the Jews, they were in the square. Each of them held in his hand a braided whip, a horse whip, a cat o' nine tails, or a steel bar. This sight instilled terror. Right away they got to work. They chopped off beards, cut out sections of hair in order to disfigure, then they photographed their victims. In the meantime, others were searching Jewish homes to see if by any chance anyone had stayed in the town. The fun in the square lasted about 2 hours. Then the Jews were arranged in rows. All those sitting on carts had to get off them. The first 4 rows were ordered to march away, and the few thousand Jews marched in the direction of the station, 4 kilometers from the city. The remaining few thousand were led through the city to the synagogue. It was already 11 in the morning. It was announced that the Jews were going to have to sit here until 6 a.m. of the next day. There was one huge room. Crowded, the Jews sat on the floor, one on top of another. A guard stood near the door. Once in a while they would come here to look, but they didn't beat. When one of the Jews had to leave to relieve himself, he had to report it. When he left, the guard would beat him with a leather whip, and the same happened when he returned. They sat like this until the end of the day, all night, without food, drink, in the dark. At dawn, someone noticed that in the hallway of the synagogue stood about 100 whips. At 6 a.m., it was announced that it was time to leave the synagogue. Near the door, everyone was whipped wherever possible, across their heads, backs, legs. In rows, they marched towards the station. The very ill were placed on plank beds that 4 Jews each would carry. Along the way, Polish neighbors stood on both sides of the rows, laughing. There were a few isolated incidents where Poles crept up to the Jews to give their close friends bread and money. The Jews were not led to the station along a straight path, but a circuitous one. There was a lot of mud here, swampy ground, 1 kilometer. Along this stretch, for the entire length of the road, they stood on both sides. The Jews were ordered to run, mud, and sing. Whips hailed down on the Jews' heads this entire time. The patches of mud were so large that shoes sank into the clay, but it was necessary to run farther and farther because they kept beating. The screams of the women and children were horrible. Blood streamed from heads, particularly the men's. Backpacks were discarded along the way in order to continue running. The carts bearing belongings got stuck along the way. Finally, the Jews reached the station. Here they were arranged into 2 rows. Now a new Gehenna began. Frisking. They looked everywhere. The better-looking ones were ordered to strip down completely, and the naked women were particularly examined. Others' clothes were torn apart at the seams. Those who were found to have something hidden, particularly the men, had to roll naked in the mud. Those who had been searched were packed into train cars waiting at the station, which were then sealed shut. There were at least 25 people in each compartment. The cars were deprived of water and light. The windows had to stay closed and during the day obscured. In these conditions, the journey lasted 36 hours. It went through Ciechanów, Mwawa, Lwowo, Königsberg, Ostrowęka, Mawkinia, from there to the East Station in Warsaw. The train stopped at some of the stations for a few minutes, but no one from the public was allowed near it. From the East Station, the Jews were taken further to Minsk Mazowiecki, Siedlec, and then to Łuków. Here the train was stopped, the cars were opened, and they came around asking how many corpses there were. That day everyone was still alive, but in the coming days a few people died each day. Soon the local Jews came to the station in their company. The newcomers were allowed to be given water. Then all the Jews were ordered into the town. The local people distributed them among various empty buildings, and many of them took them into their homes. The general attitude was very warm. They helped however they could. The first division of Jews from Nasielsk had been transported in an analogous way, but the endpoint was Międzyrzec.
This testimony was hidden in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw by Emanuel Ringelblum. He collected reports from eyewitnesses from all over Poland to preserve the history of the Holocaust. He hid the papers in milk cans and tin boxes and buried them beneath the ghetto.
Kurz vor Weihnachten sollten 1600 Juden aus Nasielsk ausgewiesen werden.
The deportation of the Jewish inhabitants of Nasielsk is also described in a German document assembled by the German army commander of Poland, General Johannes Blaskowitz. He complained about the brutality of the German troops in Poland. Harassing the population made the occupation more difficult.
Shortly before Christmas, 1,600 Jews were supposed to be deported from Nasielsk. The police locked them in the synagogue and beat the victims there with dog whips. Several Jews were immediately shot next to the synagogue. As the majority of Jews was brought to the train station, they were driven by whip blows through a particularly dirty area known as the Red Sea. 24 Jews that later returned in secret got 5 loaves of bread daily as nourishment and were locked away in an ice-cold room of which the windows were hammered closed with wooden boards. The police took their coats from them and locked them in at 9 degrees below zero. The shouting and crying of the freezing Jews, including women, could be heard in the streets. The commander of the troops that was stationed in Nasielsk had to go to the Landrat and Kreisleiter Gerblich to get the Jews transported. The matter was conveyed to the Gauleiter.
The square in Nasielsk still exists. You hear what it sounds like now, more than 80 years later. It is not a market square anymore, like in the 1930s. The cobblestones have been replaced by asphalt. In the middle is a small park that culminates in a statue of Pope John Paul II, the Polish bishop that became head of the Catholic Church in 1978. Linden trees still line the square, although they seem too small to have been there in the 30s. Most houses are still there too, but of the Jewish inhabitants of Nasielsk, nothing remains. No statue, no memorial, no sign. The only thing left is an absence, a dent in the wood on a doorpost where once a mezuzah was placed. The Jews from Nasielsk were deported in December 1939 to ghettos in different towns. 3 years later, they were brought from these ghettos to the death camp Treblinka. There, they were immediately murdered. Maurice Chandler, Maurice Chandler, managed to survive the war in Poland on false papers. The other Nasielkers who survived, like Chandler's school friend Leslie Wodek, had fled to the part of Poland that was occupied by the Soviet Union. In 1940, most of these refugees were deported to Siberia.
Of the 100 people who had been still living in 45, I found 7 still living in, 2012. 2 of them appear in the film. One is Mr. Chandler, and then Feiga Tick. She's standing with her husband, or the man who would become her husband. He also survived the war, but he is no longer living.
Glenn Kurtz and the few survivors managed to identify 11 people of the many that appear in the film.
Moshek Tuchendler, now known as Maurice Chandler.
Avrum Kubel. Simcha Rothstein. Avrum Kubel. Simcha Rothstein.
Chaim Talmud.
Burz. Chaim Nussen Zweighaft. Chaim Nussen Zweighaft. Heskia. Shmuel Tick. Shmuel Tick. Shmuel Tick. Feiga Milchberg Tick. Feiga Milchberg Tick. Charna Mirla. Miriam Mirla. Charna Mirla.
Sklep spożywczy.
Sklep spożywczy.
Polish researcher Kasia Kaspiak tried to identify the woman that steps out of the grocery store.
The big puzzle was the sign in the bottom, so the family name. I just took the method of going letter by letter and then seeing what it could give us probably. So first thing is that I could see that there were 8 letters. Then the first letter had like a belly on the top. So if there is a belly on the top, you have either P or B or. Then the second letter I couldn't really tell. The third letter was T, and this was for sure. Then the fourth letter, I would never guess. And then the fifth letter had the same kind of shadow like the letter W in the spożywczy name of the store. The sixth letter, I couldn't figure it out. Then the seventh letter, a letter having two arms at the top. So it could be either Y or K, most probably. And then the last letter, the shape looked a bit like A. And then I checked the directory book for Poland from 1929. I just went through all of the names of people who had the grocery store in Nasielsk. So then I end up with a lady called H.C.H. Rotowska. I went on a page with the indexes of the Jewish vital records, and then the name, not Rotowska, but Ratowska or Ratowski, came out. The third place to check was the index of the businesses in Warsaw from the Warsaw archives. I could see that Haja Ratuska had a store, the grocery store, sklep spożywczy, in the market square of Nasielsk. So then we had those three people who looked like actually one person, and this was confirmed by Mr. Chandler, who said that indeed the Ratowski had a grocery store on the other side of his house on Rynek in Nasielsk, which was exactly matching the emplacement of his house and the store which we were looking for.
Nowadays, monuments and memorials predominantly center around names, because a name is often all that is left of a person, the last proof of his or her existence. In this case, we have faces as traces. Faces as traces. More than 150 people appear in the film. However, they probably do not form a full cross-section of the Jewish inhabitants of Nasielsk. The very Orthodox hardly appear, for example, because they would not have wanted to be photographed.
Morgen.
Tomorrow.
Heint.
Właściciel sklepu spożywczego.
Sklep spożywczy.
We don't know what they said, but there are words that they must have said. Words that everybody always says in English, Polish or Yiddish.
Was macht ihr?
Seid also gut.
Dziękuję.
Pociąg.
Mispoche.
Bahn.
Nowy
Schwesterkind.
Jork.
Ameryka.
Schiff.
Jazdy.
Ameryka.
Essen.
Heint.
Spożywczy.
Americans.
Polen.
Schiff.
Polska.
Synagogi.
Amerika.
Heute. Polen.
New York.
Amerika.
Nasielsk.
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 Survivor Leslie Głodek remembers there was dancing in this restaurant on Saturday evenings. The radio would broadcast the BBC. He remembers Bert Ambrose and his orchestra.
Chasing shadows, chasing lovely pain, tell my heart to come lonely down apart, like a shadow I'm drifting, hoping I'll find my love, find my love.
Amerika.
Ameryka.
My grandparents traveled with three friends, Mr. and Mrs. Louis Molina, and Mr. Molina's sister, Essie Diamond, who was Mr. Molina's older sister.
Just like David Kurtz, his friend Louis Molina was born in Nasielsk and emigrated to the United States as a child. He became a successful businessman in the textile industry and lived in a large apartment on Central Park West. In 1938, he sponsored a woman named Sura Kubel to come to New York. He paid for her passage on the SS Pilsudski. According to the archive of Ellis Island, Sura Kubel, 26, corset maker, arrived in New York in November 1938, just 3 months after Louis Molina visited Nasielsk. It is probable that Sura appears in the film, but she has not been recognized. Maurice Chandler did recognize her brother, Avrum Kubel, on the steps of the synagogue.
According to her daughter, Faith, Sura Kubel never spoke about her siblings, Avram, and her 4 sisters. After Sura died, Faith found a pack of letters sent to her mother from the ghetto in Warsaw. In one of the letters, her siblings write, "We're waiting for Ezra's brother." This Ezra was not a person. The letters are full of code words drawn from Hebrew prayers to evade the German censors. Ezra means help in Hebrew.
Survivor Andrei Lubyanetsky, an actor, remembers his girlfriend Maria Włosko was trapped in the synagogue in 1939.
And I come to Nasielsk, and they told me the family from my girlfriend is in the synagogue. Other Jewish people in the synagogue, and my girlfriend, she's in the synagogue. But in my house where I live, upstairs, lives a German officer. And he is an anti-Hitlerist. He don't like when they arrest Jewish people, this. And I say to the officer, can you help me to take to the synagogue my girlfriend? He says to me, I personally can make this, but we don't have in the town electricity. I give you my number.
His code?
Yeah. Go to the synagogue.
Wow.
And say to the guy what he is there and tell him you want to arrest it. Maria Włosko. I come to the synagogue and a soldier stays with a gun, you know. First of all, hi Hitler. Hi, Hitler. I want to arrest a girl, her name is so-and-so. She is the head of the Jewish library, and she has the keys. And he calls her, Maria Mlosko, Maria Mlosko. She comes and says, an officer want to talk to you. And I take her.
Did she recognize you? No.
Absolutely.
In the beginning, she didn't know.
And I went with her to the house for my sister. When I come from my sister's house, I take off the hat with her. She said, mein Gott, kommt das nicht erkannt. And I say, tomorrow morning, we run away from here to the Book.
The Bug River, yes.
Right.
Which was the dividing line.
We crossed the border
Russia.
to Bialystok.
Right.
And in Bialystok was the Russians. And I bring her to Bialystok. And in the end, we come back to Poland. This was about 46, and we didn't find nobody from the family.
Obviously, you see, there were a lot of people, the whole city.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the occasion was that they were all in the shul. They could have been Kusevitsky coming to sing. He was in Nasielsk only one time, Moshe Kusevitsky. And he was the top-notch cantor in Poland. He was world-renowned. But I remember him being in Nasielsk just before the war. Anainu in Hebrew means answer us. You know, we pray to God. I mean, there's a lot of these prayers. And, you know, I know most of them that he sang. They were dedicated to God. So everything, the whole circle of their mindset was around God, you know, to please God and this and that. I was raised in a very religious home, and the disappointment has been so great that when I, you know, nights when I can't sleep, I think about it. My belief has been destroyed. The big issue will never be resolved. That's what Elie Wiesel at the end of his life said. Why?
In one frame of my grandfather's film, at 3 minutes, 33 seconds, 28 hundredths of a second, on the time code, 2 birds fly over the market square. In one frame of my grandfather's film, at 3 minutes, 33 seconds, 28 hundredths of a second, on the time code, 2 birds fly over the market square.
Perhaps you've noticed the quality of the footage varies. We had a special effects company clean up the film from 1938 digitally. Does it make people look more modern, more contemporary? Does it bring them closer to you? No other power on earth can do what a movie camera does, boasted the Kodak company in an advertisement in 1938. You think your memory will hold it all, but no. It slips away, it grows dim. Only a movie camera can bring it back to you with all its freshness and thrill. Kodachrome's archival abilities, coupled with its comparative ease of use, made it the dominant film stock for professionals and amateurs for most of the 20th century. Now, it's no longer manufactured. We had a 3D model created of the square in Nasielsk. Could this provide a new way to enter history? Or should we stay with the people in the film, secured in the footage by David Kurtz?
We look at these images and think that the images, in a way, show the presence of these people. But when a survivor looks at these images, they're just tokens of a life that they remember. Yes, they see the images, but it's as if they see the world around the images and outside the frame of the film as well. And one of the things that I fear most in the years to come is that we will forget that absence.
But inevitably, that is going to happen.
Of course, that's what happens. I think when we look at Greek vases, we don't think how awful the world that made sense of these vases is gone. Instead, we think how wonderful we have these vases.
But doesn't photography and film differ from other art forms in this respect? The vase in John Keats's poem Ode on Grecian Urn has a different relation to reality. The fact that a camera recorded them is evidence that these people really have existed.
Right.
At the same time, it's obvious that these 3, almost 4 minutes were captured a long time ago. The images have obtained a patina, like statues or indeed vases, and you realise that the pictures that show them so alive, forever young, are old enough to serve as proof of their probable passing as well.
Yeah.
So you have the absence, in a way, in that presence.
That's exactly right, and I think that this film really heightens that tension which is inherent in film or in photographs in general. My aunt was exactly the same age as some of the survivors. She grew up in Brooklyn. The world that she grew up in has disappeared as well. And yet, looking at the photographs from Brooklyn in 1938, it's not the same as looking at photographs from Nasielsk in 1938 because of the imminence of the danger that these people faced, and the fact that the world that they lived in would be destroyed so quickly and so soon by violence rather than gradually just by time.